All right, welcome, Matt. You're here today to talk about the DN 2023 World Championship and North Americans to debrief together. You, of course, won both of them. Congratulations.
Oh,
And
thanks, Sam. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and it what an amazing event and great sport, and of course, sailing in general is deep in my heart. So it really enjoyable to speak with you today.
thank you for being here. To kind of recap quick, you won the Worlds and the NAs, and those happened both on Lake Gonza in Madison, Wisconsin. The Worlds was Sunday through Tuesday, and the North Americans was Wednesday through Friday. The Worlds had, I think, probably 7 races, correct?
Six. We completed
Races?
6 races in the worlds. Yeah.
Races, and then 3 in the North Americans. But before we get into this, in talking about the specifics for each event, I know that during your speech after winning the Gold Cup for the Worlds, you talked a lot about preparation and how that was really important in contributing to your success this year at that event. Could you talk a little bit more about what preparation you went through in order to get prepared for the event, especially living, outside of the Midwest of the U.S., not in a cold area?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Of course, I'm from Michigan, Bay City, Michigan, home Jan and me Gujan and some other great sailors. Moved to San Diego 13 years ago, so really separated from the cold weather, if you will. And I knew it was going to require a much different approach if I were to be, have any kind of success. And of course, success in the World Championship Gold Cup really is, honestly, top 10 is a great performance with the best sailors in the world. So, I looked at it that it was going to require something a little bit different. And of course, the portion of sailing was going to be missing a large part from my preparation. So for me, it really started about 18 months, 20 months ago before the event. And I was pretty determined to be prepared. And I should say, I race foiling moss here locally and roam around with a great group of sailors here on the West Coast and in the US as well. So it sort of twofold, my preparation for DN ice boat racing also benefited me for my saltwater sailing as well. But yeah, up to about 2 years ago, I really put a charge on and just dedicated that, I was going to get as fit as I could, given my work schedule and, daily life with family and kids and all the stuff. It certainly has not gotten any easier or streamlined, but, in the gym a couple days a week. Luckily here in San Diego, train with what you have locally. So I did a lot of cycling and of course, moss sailing, and that led up nicely, I would suggest, to, sort of the late fall, early winter season. And so then I laid out sort of a strategic plan, last summer, to where I was going to, of course, my parents' family still live in Michigan. So I was going to visit them for Thanksgiving, and then I just extended that by a week. And so I really that was maybe my biggest effort, and really sort of almost the last phase, honestly, of my preparation, to where I knew I had to get time in the boat. If there was an area that I was going to be short on, was certainly, just seat time in my boat. And given that I've always tried to evolve in equipment and gear. So Composite Concepts built me a new mast. Ron Sherry there had a new mast, new plank ready for me when I arrived over Thanksgiving. I showed up in Bay City. I took the red eye in next morning, got my dad to give me a ride, and we drove down to Composite Concepts, picked up the new gear, and back to Bay City. I spent a day in Bay City, and then my traveling partner Jim Grogan and I were planning on heading up to, actually, Thunder Bay is what our intention was. He had a bit of an accident at home and hurt his ankle. So I was now, sort of left without transportation or anyone to travel with. But I was, one thing on my side was determination. So I found a rental car place back at the airport, arrived there. And the interesting thing is, they handed me the keys to a car. I didn't even know what I was getting. I went out and I was like, oh boy, I wish it had a little bit better system so I could tie ice boats on it better. So I went back inside, and the lady there at the counter said, well, that's our last car, so you can take that one or no car at all. So I figured out how to make that work and tie some ice boats on top of it. And I decided, well, I'm just going to head west. If you don't, there were a lot of people, and it's natural that there's no ice, the conditions are poor, whatever. So but it's like any sailing, it's you're in the weather, it's who knows what it's going to be. If you're not there, you're for sure not going to sail. So I just started drove up over the Mackinac Bridge and headed west, talking with Ron, and then finally John Dennis. And John Dennis said, yeah, come to my house, this would be a good base. So I traveled over there, and I spent ultimately 6 days sailing in Minnesota. I never did make it to Thunder Bay because there were so many good options in Minnesota. And ultimately, we ended up at the Western Challenge on a lake up in northern Minnesota. And Minnewaska, I think, was the name of the lake in Starbuck, Minnesota. And just a lovely little town. And we drove over the hill, Mike Bloom and myself. I finally connected with in Minnesota, and just an absolute magical black ice as far as I could see, a lake about 1.5 miles wide, 8.5 miles long, and just absolutely black ice just as far as you could see. So I had some excellent sailing. So during my 6 days in Minnesota, I sailed in everything from, of course, black ice, fast speed sails, to a couple of days in snow, a day on bumpy ice. So I looking back on it and even thinking at the time, this is by far the best practice training I could have for whatever the worlds and North Americans were going to bring, because the variety of conditions, from light air, heavy air, clean, fast ice, to bumpy snow, sticky ice, was pretty widespread. So I thought it was excellent practice. And then I was back at Christmas time, a little bit of a Christmas break. I was in Michigan and sailed a couple of days in Michigan. And of course, during all this time, I was, strategically working on my equipment as well as myself in sailing mode. And, the new mast really was proving to be really strong. And my goal going into the season is always to, vet out the equipment as early as I can, which I had a very limited amount of time. And that then allows me to sort of change mindsets for ultimately the event I'm training for, to where it's, sailing is a bit of luck, skill, and then of course, just the performance of your equipment. And my goal is to always to put the equipment side, resolve that as quickly as possible, so that I can, just ultimately focus on sailing and performing in the regatta. So it was a great preparation. I think, maybe a lot of people joke, maybe I sailed more than anybody leading into the World Championship, and I don't know, maybe that's true. But I can tell you one thing for sure, is if I lived in the region still, I would have sailed more.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I think, kind of like going off of the discussion about equipment, I'm still fairly new to the sport of ice boating, but my understanding is that over the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of the masts from Europe have tended to be a little bit softer. And now with this new mast that you're talking about, the pre-preg carbon mast, how did you feel like that was different than the one that you had before? And do you think that it was, evenly matched and comparable to those softer ones from Europe?
Yeah, the really fascinating thing is actually it's a touch stiffer than the previous masts that I were using, which are, I would suggest, are significantly stiffer than a lot of the Europeans, especially the Poles, are using. And I don't know that they're necessarily wrong. I don't think it's a right or wrong answer. It's just different. And, if you look at the boat setup, Europeans and a lot of the US guys today are using the softer mast, and they're putting the mast up all the way to the back of the adjustment, which effectively is trying to reduce the geometry or increase the geometry of the forestay to the mast angle, and therefore, stiffen it up a little bit. I'm really pleased with my new mast is it's a little bit stiffer, and therefore I use the range of the adjustment of the boat that we have built into the rules. And I think that's a pretty reasonable advantage, because it allows me to transform the performance of the boat to match the conditions that I'm dealing with. So in slow, sticky snow ice, I can push the mast up forward, makes the rig a little bit more compliant. And then as soon as the breeze comes up a little bit, or fast ice, I can slide the mast up back, and it really transforms the performance. And I think, on Monday of the World Championships, I think we saw a bit of glimpse of that. The first day of the Worlds, of course, was extremely challenging for me because I had to sail through the 2 qualifiers. I don't know if you want to explain how the world ranking system works, but because I had not sailed a world championship or a continental event in, I think, since 2017, which was on Lake Kinganza, I believe. The world championships were Karol Jablonski was first and I was second. So that's kind of fun as well. The roles were reversed this time. But because I did not have a world ranking list, I had to sail through the bronze and silver qualifiers, and it was, light air, a little bit sticky, this kind of condition. So, and in that we had the 2 qualifiers, 1 bronze, 1 silver. I made it through both those to the gold, and then the gold race, unfortunately, was even, of course, more difficult because the cream rises to the top, but it also, the conditions had gotten really difficult with a big wind shift during the first upwind beat of the race. And of course, I was on the opposite side of that shift, so it made it quite difficult. But on Monday, we had pretty good breeze, and particularly the last couple of races of the World Championship on Monday, I don't know what the breeze got up to, but it was, blowing the snow across the ice pretty good, maybe 15 knots or something. And at that point, my gear, my equipment, I think had a bit of an edge on most of the folks out there. So it felt good once I was able to get the rig out into clean air and really let it go fast.
Nice. That's great. At the event too, did you also have any sort of new plank that was new in the last couple of years? And was your hull new as well, or did you have any other new equipment besides like a new sail and a new mast?
No, actually, pretty fascinating is my base program is really frozen back in, I guess, 2009 kind of era. I won the worlds in 2007, 8, and 9, and then relocated for work out here to San Diego. So that it's the same hulls. Ron Sherry built me 2 hulls back in the early 2000s, and that's exactly what I'm using today. Ron built me a new plank, one of the balsa cores glass planks, and I did some sailing with it. I didn't get a lot of time on it, so I was again just strategically looking at what is confirmed better and what can I use to be competitive in the World Championship. And I ultimately ended up using my hull and plank that I've had for a number of years, new mast, and actually my sails are a bit have a few hours on them as well. No new sails, but one of the things I talked to Mike Boston about is the new mast that Ron has. The sails have never looked better. Actually, it's very fascinating. So it just overall, small incremental improvements made big differences on the race course.
Sure. And it's my it's like my understanding that that dynamic between the mast and the plank is really important, right? In terms of how much they bend and how much the plank deflects. Do you know how much your plank deflects compared to others in terms of, inches or millimeters, whatever the right
Ye-
measurement is?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and it's a good question. Overall, the dynamic relationship between the mast and the plank are really critical. I mean, for example, you don't want a stiff mast and a really soft plank. Ultimately the plank ends up bending a whole lot, and the mast is not bending much. Um, so they do need to be, really in harmony between the two of them. And that's one of the things I have going on right now. The plank I'm using, which I've had for some time, is a little bit on the stiffer side, which of course complements the slightly stiffer mast. I think probably something we should be doing as a class is talking in, spring rates and things like plank. So it's traditionally everybody speaks about how much the plank bends with their weight, or whatever the scenario is. But anyway, short of the long is, the plank I'm using today is about 125 pounds per inch spring rate. So quite a bit stiffer, I think, than certainly historically I've used, and I think stiffer than most people are using today.
Gotcha. Last question about equipment stuff. I was curious how invested you are in the runner war scenario in terms of, did you show up at the event with, nearly all of the potential runner options that you could have wanted, or do you tend to stick with more of a basic, simpler program where you have limited options compared to some other people?
Oh my gosh, runners! That is the one area of ice boating that is such a difficult arena, uh, more mentally than anything, honestly. But yeah, I've got piles of runners. Um, Pretty well can cover all conditions that we would sail in, and of course, I brought all of them with me. Uh, that in itself, having a lot of runners obviously doesn't solve the problem in the regatta. You have to pick the right runner for the right moment, and of course, in a regatta, we're limited to 9 runners, so it's a relatively narrow slice, a pie of the number of runners that I have, for example, or most of the top competitors have. So it's kind of a difficult area of especially DN ice boat racing. I think in general terms, I would say anyone getting into the class, or just sailing, getting going, you really need 2 sets of runners to really be able to perform in 90% of the conditions that we ever sail in. And that's 3/16 inserts, 36 inches long, with a nice clean standard profile, 18 inches of crown, and then a set of snow plates. That pretty well will get you through 90% of the conditions we sail in. Now, as a world championship, of course, we're looking for every last inch of advantage or competitiveness, and that having more runners almost makes it significantly more difficult or worse. What runners do you use? What will you use today that then limits you tomorrow, if the conditions or the forecast are changing? So I think it's very difficult, but I did use a number of runners. It's when I'm back training or practicing, I have a set of travel runners or delivery runners that are 3/16 inserts, 18 inches of crown, and I race those in most regional events or scrub racing, and they really work great. And it turns out in the worlds and North Americans, really my primary go-to runner in the worlds was a set of 3/16 inserts, 100 degrees, and a little bit flatter. I think they're about 19 or 20 inches of flat. So the ice we were sailing on was pretty grippy, so lateral stability was no problem. And I used those for most all of the event in the world championships.
Interesting. One of the things that I was curious about is, at an event like a world championship or an NAs or a Europeans, you are only allowed to have 9 runners at the event, correct?
Right.
Are you able to bring, more than 9 runners like out on the ice and then just stick that verification sticker on it, right before a race? Or do you tend to select, your 9 runners on day 1 or 2 and then just only bring those 9 out to the race course?
No, it's a good question, and it's almost part of the problem is you don't need to declare what you're going to use until you actually use it in a race. So I'd rig up my boat, and I have three sails. You're allowed two sails. I've got too many runners to count, and you're allowed nine. So obviously the hull, the mast, the boom, the plank are pretty straightforward. You know what you're going to use, but sails and runners, I don't put the stickers on until I'm validated that I'm going to use those in the actual race.
Gotcha. Good to know. Is there anything else that you think we should talk about in terms of equipment, or should we start diving into the actual event?
Yeah, I mean, I think the event itself actually ties equipment in naturally. It's a big part of ice boating for sure. It's not just having the hardware, the equipment. It's knowing when to use it, right, or how to use it. And I think during the Worlds especially, we ultimately ended up with a really good U.S. Team, I would say, in development or confirmation of both the conditions and the equipment that we were going to use. So I think it ties together pretty well, actually.
Sure, sure. So at the actual event, let's start with the Worlds. Feel free to correct me on this, but it seemed like day one, we had some pretty hard ice. It was a little bit bumpy, but fairly hard, with probably half an inch to an inch of fresh powdery snow on top of it, right? That's kind of like where we started off for the event, right?
Yeah, it would have been wonderful if the conditions all week would have stayed with what we started with on that Sunday of the Worlds, because we had mostly clear, textured, bumpy ice with little frozen snow drifts that were not all that impactful to the drag of sailing, and and it was light air that first Sunday. It With just a little bit of breeze, it was actually quite lovely sailing, and would have been fantastic. Of course, as Mother Nature would have it, we ended up with a fresh, light dusting of snow for that Monday. I guess Sunday evening into Monday morning, we ended up with a fresh coat of snow over the whole race course, and of course that continued to evolve all week long.
Sure. And on that Sunday too, like you were saying, it was light air, and you had to sail both the bronze qualifier, the silver qualifier, and then the actual gold fleet race, which was the only race for the gold fleet that was completed on that Sunday. What did you select for your equipment, and what was your strategy kind of going into those races? Because I'm assuming that you must have been trying different things out, or at least learning things in between each qualifier in order to get to the gold fleet race.
Yeah, there's a couple of aspects that are quite fascinating to me. One is not having a ranking, not being pre-qualified into the A fleet or the gold fleet, added a whole nother level of strategy and stress, quite honestly, because those races, they count for, you start in bronze and they move the top 12 finishers then into silver, and then they race, and then they move those top 12 finishers into gold fleet. So that means the 13th place in each of those qualifiers is the first in their respective fleets then going forward. So what I'm getting at is those races, they're not solely a qualifier, they are part of the regatta ultimately. So therefore the equipment that I were to declare for those races, they count. So it's a very difficult scenario, because going in, I knew I had a pretty, good indication, obviously, if I could sail clean and I didn't have any breakdown or bad luck or something, I would advance to the next fleet. But none of that is guaranteed at all, right? You could be on the wrong side of the course, wind shifts, or you're in a hole, you're in a snowdrift. There's just a lot of scenarios. Hull to plank fitting fails, and that's it. You get one chance at it. So almost the qualifiers for me were almost more difficult than the actual gold fleet racing for the world championship, because none of it matters if I didn't qualify up. So I had to choose my best equipment, which comes with risk as well, because not only is it's possible we don't get in a Gold Fleet race that day, and therefore Gold Fleet race the next day and the conditions completely change, which they did. And I've already burned 3 of my runner choices and 1 of my sail choices, so it would limit me going forward. But most importantly is I had to put a boat on the starting line for the qualifiers that I could have my best chance at moving forward and qualifying up to the next fleet. And that's a lot of work, quite honestly. I think in the rules there's 20 minutes between qualifiers or something, but you race that first bronze qualifier, it was light air, so it's the races are relatively long in ice boat terms, and then you finish and the clock starts ticking at the 12th place finisher, which is the last of the qualifiers. And if you want to make any equipment adjustment, change, refinements, if you got a nick in a runner and you need to stone that out or sand it out or something like that, you don't have a lot of time, and you're right back on the starting line for the next qualifier. So it was a bit of a workout on that first Sunday for sure.
Definitely. And then going into Monday, you were in the Gold Fleet. Stress was probably a little bit decreased because you actually qualified, but then the pressure was on to actually perform in the Gold Fleet too. And I guess kind of like showing up at the pits on Monday, we probably knew that it was going to be a longer day of sailing compared to the following day and the day before. Good wind was forecasted, pretty solid conditions. What was your strategy going into that Monday, where you knew that we probably have 4 or 5 races in?
Yeah, it actually, my gears really started turning Sunday evening about Monday, because I'd made it through the 2 qualifiers successfully. I was the first qualifier in both bronze and silver. Then the third race, final race of the day and first Gold Fleet race, like I mentioned earlier, the wind was light, a little bit lighter than it had been in the 2 qualifiers, extremely shifty. And of course, the best sailors now are on the racetrack. So in that race, golly, I think I got as high as 3rd place at one point in that race, and then I'm certain I was back in the deep 20s at some point during that race. It was just all over. And for anyone who's raced sailboats knows that once you're in the middle of the fleet, your race strategy in many ways is getting dictated to you. So it was quite difficult race for me. I ultimately ended up finishing 9th in that first Gold Fleet race. So certainly just hanging on by a thread for the top 10. And so I certainly looking at the forecast for Monday looked much more favorable for me. A little bit more stable condition, a little bit more breeze, and a different angle as well. And knowing that probably the race committee would really try to stretch out the racetrack a little bit more. I think on Sunday we were probably on about 0.82 tenths of a mile or so a little bit shorter race course, 3 laps. And ultimately on Monday we ended up going to 1.2 miles for a weather leg 3 times around. So I was quite motivated Monday morning, up very early, and my traveling partners were early risers as well. So we got out to the ice just after daybreak, and I sailed out to the starting line. Pat Heppard and the race team did an unbelievable job. They had every morning just after sunrise, I could see the weather mark set, and the marks were out there, and they were getting organized nice and early. So what that gave a great opportunity for me is to get out to the leeward mark and start evaluating not only the current conditions but my own gear and how can I figure this out, because I felt quite vulnerable actually, because I finished in 9th in the first Gold Fleet race. I knew I wasn't tuned really that well, quite honestly. I was set up for light air and sticky ice. Now we had a little bit more breeze. There's certain settings, we talked about mast step earlier, but just general rig tension, mast rake, sail height, let alone which sail, what runners. So I was out there early, and of course, the whole Polish team were out there, and they were just running, drag races alongside each other, very clearly testing equipment. This was certainly their regatta to lose, I would say. They were so well organized, so versed in equipment, and of course, working together. I was a bit alone at the moment, so I looked over. I saw Chad Atkins, who I know, I've known for quite some time, A-class catamaran sailing, of course, ice boating things, and I yelled over, Chad, let's do some sailing. Let's do some training. Let's figure this out. And he was, immediately, game on. Right, he's going fast, and had the same thing in mind. And actually, it was a really good moment. I think a huge turning point for me in the regatta, because Chad came over. He and I had done some lineups. We collected Chris Berger and ultimately James Thayer T. So all of a sudden we had a really good slice of the U.S. potential in our camp, and we really coordinated and organized it. We tried different sails because the breeze was up, the ice was fast, but snow drifts, so it was a very tricky scenario. It wasn't just a go-to condition. So we were trying, two of us would use speed sails, two would use full sails. We would baseline runners, and then we would, rotate and confirm. And it felt, Gold Fleet was the first race of the day, so it was a bit of a race against time. But I was extremely confident at that point that I was getting better. My equipment, right, my setup, my refinement of my kit, I was at least at a bare minimum. I didn't know how I was going in comparison to the Poles and the other competitors, but I knew in our, impromptu training group that we were all getting better. We were eliminating things that were not fast, and we were all gravitating towards equipment and setups that were certainly better. So I thought that was extremely fascinating, helpful, and I 100% convinced I would not have performed as well as I did on Monday without that preparation. The bad news is I was extremely tired by the time we got to the first Gold Fleet lineup. I don't know how many speed runs and lineups we had done, but I remember thinking to myself, my gosh, I don't know if I can race 4 races if they put that to the ice, because I was getting a bit tired just from the speed runs we were doing, but it turned out I was able to hang in there.
That's really good to hear about that, because I know that for myself as an observer in the pits, I got out there probably 45 minutes before the start of the first race for Gold Fleet. And I could definitely see that there was some training going on. Like the Poles would go out for like 2 laps, come back. You and your group would go out for a couple laps and come back. And I was always curious about what you guys were changing, and how you're going about that actual analytic process. So that's really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, and I at first it felt like almost a little bit of leap of faith, but it was absolutely necessary in my mind. There was no way I was going to get there by myself, and I knew Chad Atkins was going very good. We sailed together at the Western Challenge, and I know his gear was really good and well prepared. So it because you never always know. I mean, normally, right, for local regattas or whatever, we'd be competing against one another directly, right? So this was a little bit more country oriented, and therefore I think all of us were being extremely honest with what we had to offer, and complement one another ultimately. So it was really very rewarding activity we did, and I'm really happy that we did that, and it had a lot of meaning ultimately. Obviously for myself, but I think for them as well. in the following races. I think looking at the results, they certainly improved as well.
Sure. And what did you end up settling on for that Monday morning first couple of races? You know, like you were saying, the wind had kind of blown off the full coverage of snow, so you know there was definitely some kind of lighter, not super stiff patches of snow, and then some also patches of just clear ice, probably 10, 15 knots of wind.
Yep. Yeah, our training together before the first race, it really cleared up the runner decision. I would say that's one thing that became crystal clear without question. And I had switched to 3/16 inserts, 90-degree angle, so a little bit sharper angle, a little better holding, knowing that there was a little bit more breeze, and then also wings on them. So that's a beautiful set of runners I have from Composite Concepts, and they're really my go-to if you can go fast. They're really stable, strong, all that stuff. So that was locked in. Now the fascinating part is all of our training, of course, was before the first race, and we were going through sales. And in my sale inventory, the FO1 sale in our speed runs was the best all around sale in the speed run. So if you hit a little bit of a snow drift, you could ease the sheet and had a little bit more power. We had tried the ABSS speed sale, and when it was a little bit, if someone had a clear run, it was a little better. You could point a little higher, go a little faster. So we were right on that bubble, and I had my FO1 sale up as they were, getting ready to call the Gold Fleet to the starting line. And immediately, and this happens so often, it's so interesting, the breeze came up. So I knew at that point, I've got no choice. I have to change sales. So the beauty of the program, the 3 sales from Mike Boston and the rig from Ron is I've got everything set to where I can change sales and nothing else has to change. Slide the boom off, the blah, everything works. So FO1 came down. Someone standing there gave me a hand, one of our local guys, and put up the ABSS speed sail and push the boat up to the starting line. So it even as much training and practicing we had done, I ultimately ended up changing equipment about a minute and a half before pushing up to the starting line. But because the training, the practice we had done in the morning, I already knew. I knew if the breeze came up a click that was going to be the go-to sail.
Sure, it's good to know. I guess one kind of might be a slightly random question, but it's one that I've been thinking about a lot. Is what do you do if you maybe don't have enough time to change a sail like right before a start? Like if the breeze had come up 2 minutes later, and you still had the FO1 on, and you might have felt like you were a little bit overpowered. What are some of the things that you would change during the race, since you can't really adjust your actual rig anymore? Especially because if you're sailing like a softwater boat, you should probably pull in Cunningham, outhaul, stuff like that. But on an ice boat, you can pretty much only move your body weight around and change your steering and sail trim, correct?
Yep, that's right. And if I was on the starting line still and it was too late to change sails, I would have immediately dropped the halyard one ball on the halyard adjuster just to narrow up the gap between the boom and the deck, because if the breeze is up and the ice is fast, I'm not going to need as much mechanical advantage on the main sheet to get the rig to bend. It's going to occur more dynamically, naturally. And then the technique in sailing the boat, if it wouldn't be a complete lost cause, I don't think, even on the race course. So you just sail the boat a little differently. And what I mean by that is, maybe upwind, sailing a little bit higher, perhaps, just knowing that there is going to be a little bit more induced drag with the fuller sail. And so tactically, how can I use that maybe to my advantage? And, so I might just sail the boat a little bit different, a little bit higher, obviously a little bit slower. And then downwind, maybe a same thing, a little bit deeper and not quite as fast. And the opposite is true as well. If you're caught with a speed sail and the breeze goes a bit light, you might be forced to foot a little bit going upwind, and downwind you got to make sure you keep your foot on the gas pedal, make sure you're sailing it hot, because I think more than anything, that's the biggest separation oftentimes in regattas, is just adapting to the realities that you have, as a boat, as equipment. You can't always have the perfect setup, but you've got to adapt to what you have to work with.
Sure. Great answer. So now we're kind of like going through day one of the worlds, or sorry, day two of the worlds. And you had a pretty successful day, I think, right? You had a couple of good finishes, and you were in a position going into day three to make a run at the World Championship. What did you learn from that day two that might have influenced your strategy for day three?
Yeah, day two on Monday was really something, because I had obviously a bit of a breakthrough, and the conditions suited me quite well, and I finished the day with 1-1, two first place finishes. So that was, obviously I was feeling quite good about that, but knew that it was all to play for still. But obviously from that first race on Sunday at a ninth, and then I think on Monday I went 4-3-1-1, working my way up to the lead. And of course, in ice boat racing, one of the huge advantages of finishing well is that's your starting position for the next race. So it just gives you more options, particularly if you want to tack up the middle of the course or something like that. In other ways, it maybe makes it more difficult, because the whole half of the fleet is below you, and can if you don't get a good start, they can kind of dictate where you're going to go. So that part's tricky. And then going into the following day, golly, the forecast was just not great. It was light air, a little bit of breeze in the morning. I don't know, maybe 8 knots or something, and with a trend line that was not looking conducive to good sailboat racing. We had 5 races in the regatta at the end of the day Monday. So going into Tuesday, there's a max number of races of 7, and certainly the race committee was trying to get there within the time allotted for the regatta. But it turned to be very challenging. I think they started with some of the other fleets first, and there was a fairly decent breeze, and they got around the race course. Gold Fleet got up to the starting line, and while the breeze was going, took a hard right, and there was a lot of, you could tell there was a fair bit of stress on the starting line with some of the competitors. There was vocalizing a lot of discontent with the current conditions and the race committee, and so it was quite hard. I think it was a tough time to be running the races. Of course, I was on the number 1 start slot, and all my toughest competitors were all around on both sides. So I obviously had a good seat to observe all that. Ultimately, the wind settled down, came back to a nice windward leeward, but lighter breeze. It had come down from 8 or so knots down to, I don't know, 6, and what a big difference that made given our ice conditions that we had. So we had a little bit of snow on the ice. Snow drifts were a little deeper from the previous day. Just a much more difficult situation to sail in, from a fair, even race course point of view. But nonetheless, they started the race. My side of the course was not going great, and I ultimately ended up tacking over across the middle, and I started on the right side of the course, the first upwind beat, and of course, as soon as I tack over on the starboard and look at the left side, there's a pretty significant differential between sides. The left side was in breeze and pretty far ahead. When I finally, obviously I knew then I've got to get left, right? If I have any chance of just being in the race, this could easily determine the outcome of the World Championship. And because I had that 9 in the first race as a throwout. I didn't have a lot of room to work. So I made it over the left side. Sure enough, got into more breeze, tacked over, and I was going quite good actually. I just starting out with such a deficit. When I went around the weather mark, I couldn't even see who was leading the race, or even, I couldn't tell who the top 10 leaders of the race were at that point. So, but with all sailboat racing, you just got to put your head down, stay calm, and think through it. What is the best strategic opportunity to move yourself up the board. So I went around. I had incredibly tough battle with some of the Polish sailors during that race. Robert Gracie was going fast, was a little bit ahead of me, but I was going a little faster. I was getting closer. And the second time, or the first time down around Leeward Mark, I just cleared. There's a safety Darling Mark just upwind of Leeward Mark for safety, and I tacked onto starboard. And Robert, who was in second place at the time, in the overall for the World Championship, he won the Worlds last year. I tacked onto starboard. He was a bit ahead of me. He tacked onto starboard, and of course, immediately put his bow down and sailed right over the top of me. And I was not going real good at that point. I just wasn't, again, in breeze. And so now I was just in his exhaust, trying to, and it was a one-sided racetrack, so I had to get left side. I couldn't tack away for clean air. And it's the pain of being in the middle of the fleet and getting your race dictated to you. So, but I stayed calm, and I was able to find a couple of nice clear lanes in the race course on the ice, and I was able to just work up above him and therefore clear my breeze. And I was just hanging in there, and then all of a sudden I got into the breeze, and the boat it's such a cool feeling in an ice boat when you get a little bit of pressure, the rig bends out, plank bends, windward runner just flies off the ice, and you slide down into the cockpit to get out of the windage, and get really low drag. And sure enough, I started climbing. Then I was not only going faster, but I was sailing higher than him, and I had gotten up inside almost right next to him by the time we got to the port ley line. And so as soon as he initiated attack, I, of course, rolled over onto port. And at this point, quite honestly, we were a little bit overstood to the windward mark and the Darling Mark that's there for safety at the windward mark. So now I could put the bow down, and the boat went really fast. And in that light of breeze, it was 5-6 knots of breeze, and the boat was really going quick. And at that point, I really sailed by a lot of boats. And so even though we were having an epic battle, we were both going pretty fast and working our way through the group. So, another downwind, I got around the weather mark and continued the good pace. And all of a sudden I started noticing, golly, there's not a lot of boats ahead of me anymore. It wasn't, through this battle, it wasn't clear to me who was leading the race, or who the top contenders were, but I could tell I was getting closer. And going around Leeward Mark, I cut a lot of distance out, and that last windward beat, I got by another good group of boats, and all of a sudden, I think I went around the weather mark in like third place the last windward mark rounding. So I'd clawed back a long way. And there was one of the young guys from Sweden was leading the race, and it was really light air at this point, and he was way slid forward in his boat, and he was flying a runner really high, almost like when when I sailed catamarans a lot, Wild Thing, it was called downwind. Well, that's how he was sailing his ice boat. And it stood out. So it was so ironic to me, because I couldn't tell if that was somebody just out day sailing and like reaching around, or it was someone on the racetrack. But he was really all in that technique and going. But I was sailing lower and faster, and I sailed right up to him, and we both jibed out, which should have been in the typical race course management, should have been the port ley line to the finish. And I jibed just inside of him, sailed by him. So now I made myself up to the lead. I was leading the race, and I thought, golly, what an amazing, race in such challenging conditions. Well, it wasn't over at that point. I sailed. He and I sailed on port tack over, and by now there's so many boats that we had lapped. It was very difficult to race course management, and I was getting tangled up. I got right down by the leeward mark, and I was on the high side, the windward side of a lap boat, so I couldn't jibe. And we were going into lighter and lighter wind, and the Swedish kid jibed, got back into breeze, and by the time I jibed back, I could, I still was not too disconnected from him, but he clearly was ahead of me. But then I looked to my right, and there was an unbelievable fleet of boats coming in, and they were coming in fast. They were coming with breeze. And oh my gosh, I had to get out of my boat and run on starboard tack now back, and I'm within 100 meters of the finish line, and jibe back. And then when I jibe back onto port, Carol Jablonski was coming in on starboard. I had to jibe back again. It was all just coming unglued for me, it felt like. But nonetheless, I jibed back to port, had to push one more time, jump in the boat, sail across the finish. But it was complete chaos, because the number of lapped boats, plus now all the leaders that had come in with the breeze from the left side of the race course, I had no idea. I don't know if I finished third or 15th. I had no idea. And we crossed the finish line, and there were some people pretty excited, not in a good way, that it wasn't a fair race and all kinds of things. And my take on it is, you let the race management team do their job and determine what's what. And but they ultimately announced that was the end of the regatta. The conditions had fallen apart, and that would be the sixth and final race of the world championship. And unbelievably, I was still in the lead by a couple of points. So it took a few minutes to realize that somehow I'd managed to win, and it was a very successful couple-year effort, I would say.
Congratulations! That's being someone who was watching the end of that race from the pits. That was probably the most exciting finish to an ice boat race. Running, both people sailing. That was pretty crazy. There was definitely a lot of emotions going through the whole fleet at that point too. Must have been pretty difficult for Deb Whitehorse and her scoring team to score everybody.
Yeah, I think that is a good story for the entire week or regatta, is the amount of in DN racing, call it the BART rule. If you're lapped, you finish on the checkered flag, and trying to unwind that on paper is, I think, quite difficult when it's a significant number of lapped racers. But they got there, and they did a great job. So it certainly worked out, but very time consuming.
Definitely. Well, that might be a good place to end the discussion. I think that we're kind of running up on our hour time limit too. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss briefly before we call it an end of a meeting?
Well, I think overall, obviously, sailboat racing is certainly a love of mine, has been my whole life. Ice boat racing is golly, I don't know if there's anything better, quite honestly. The people, the equipment, the sailing, the whole deal is really, really fun. It's a chance for individuals to have their own little kind of F1 team, if you will. You pick your equipment, you can tune it to your liking, you make little changes, profiles of runners and sharpness and sails and masts and the whole deal. So it's really a very economical way, I think, to have really a high performing kit of a sailboat and a racing machine. So it's really enjoyable, really fun. The people, the atmosphere, the whole thing about it. And it you always feel like you've accomplished something when you finish an ice boat regatta. I mean, the conditions it's not easy. It's cold, long days on the ice. It certainly is anything but simple and easy, but very, very rewarding.
I agree 100%. Matt Struble, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to discuss and debrief the worlds, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.